My name is Beverly. I am 62 years old, and my occupation is the founder and owner of a multi-million-dollar catering and soul food business. For decades, I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building a legacy, giving my only son a life of absolute privilege, so he would never know the sting of poverty. But when I decided to test his loyalty by pretending I had lost every single dime in a terrible investment, I never expected his wife to strike like a viper the minute she thought I was down. She assumed I was just a helpless, broken old woman, completely unaware that her ruthless betrayal was about to cost her the very fortune she was desperately trying to steal. I have been a widow for 15 long years. When my husband passed away, I did not let grief destroy me. Instead, I woke up at 4 a.m. every single day, baking, cooking, and catering events, until my hands cramped and my feet went numb. I turned a tiny kitchen hustle into a massive, thriving success. I gave my son Jamal the absolute world. I paid his Ivy League tuition in full, making sure he graduated without a single cent of debt. I funded his lavish, over-the-top wedding down to the very last imported flower. And more importantly, I kept my mouth shut when he married Chloe, a white woman who never quite saw me as an equal. For years, I noticed her subtle microaggressions. I saw the way she mocked my traditional cooking as just heavy soul food, and the way she turned her nose up at the working-class neighborhood, where I built my very first commercial kitchen. She would walk through my beautifully furnished home, acting as if my hard-earned money was her natural birthright. But I bit my tongue and swallowed my pride for Jamal's sake. I played the accommodating, polite mother-in-law simply to keep the peace in our family. Then came my 62nd birthday. I needed to know the truth. I needed to know if the family I had sacrificed everything for actually loved me for who I was, or if they only loved the checkbook I carried in my purse. At what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner, I put on an Oscar-worthy performance. With tears welling in my eyes and my voice trembling, I announced that my business investments had completely collapsed in a fraudulent real estate deal. I told them I was bankrupt and practically penniless. I expected shock. I expected concern, or at least a comforting hug from the son I had given everything to. Instead, the sweet, loving facade Chloe had worn for years evaporated into thin air in an instant. The very next morning, not even 24 hours after my fake, tearful confession, Chloe marched right into my living room without even knocking. She marched straight up to my coffee table and slammed down a thick stack of cheap, depressing nursing home brochures. She did not call me Mum, like she usually faked doing. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice dripping with cold condescension, and said, "You cannot afford to live here anymore, Beverly. My brother Travis is moving into this house tomorrow, so you need to start packing right now. Let me tell you exactly how I built my empire. Because it did not come from a silver spoon. It came from flour-hot grease and bone-deep exhaustion. When Jamal's father passed away, my boy was barely old enough to understand why his daddy was not coming home. I was left with a mountain of medical bills, a broken heart, and a very small kitchen. I did not have the luxury of time to grieve. I had to survive. Every single morning, long before the sun even thought about rising, I was awake at 4 o'clock. I stood in that cramped, drafty kitchen, mixing biscuit dough, frying chicken, and perfecting my famous peach cobbler. I started out small, selling plates to the local barbershops, the beauty salons, and the churches in our community. My feet ached so badly by the end of the day that I would soak them in Epsom salt just to be able to stand up the next morning. The blisters on my heels and the burn marks on my forearms became my badges of honor. But every time I looked at Jamal sleeping peacefully in his bed, I knew I had to keep pushing forward. I turned those individual plates into a catering service, and over the years, that catering service blossomed into a multi-million-dollar soul food enterprise. I worked myself to the absolute bone, so my son would never have to know what it felt like to go to bed hungry or wear second-hand clothes. I wanted him to have the luxury of dreaming big, something I never had the chance to do when I was his age. And because I loved him so fiercely, I trusted him completely. I thought giving him everything financially would build an impenetrable wall of security around us, an unbreakable family bond that nothing could touch. I paid his tuition at an Ivy League university in full, so he would not graduate with a single cent of debt. I bought him his first luxury vehicle so he could drive to his job interviews with pride. I gave him the massive down payment for a high-rise condo when he graduated. I showered him with my hard-earned wealth because I truly believed a mother's provision would cement a foundation of absolute trust and love. I never once questioned his choices or asked for a penny back. I just wanted my son to be happy, safe and secure in a world that is not always kind to young black men. I thought my financial sacrifices were a shield for him, but I did not realize I was building a pedestal for someone who would eventually forget the hands that laid the bricks. I poured every ounce of my soul into his success, blinding myself to the reality that unearned privilege can sometimes rot a person's character from the inside out. My absolute trust was a heavy blindfold, preventing me from seeing the entitlement that was quietly growing right under my own roof. That blindfold began to slip the very day Jamal brought Chloe home. Chloe was a white woman from a wealthy suburban family, a woman who moved through the world with a sense of effortless, undeniable entitlement. Along with Chloe came her older brother Travis, a man who always seemed to be looking for a quick shortcut to a heavy paycheck. From the very beginning, I felt the icy chill of Chloe's subtle microaggressions. It was never outright disrespect initially, but rather those little cutting remarks, perfectly disguised as polite conversation. When I hosted her for Sunday dinner, she would pick at my collard greens and macaroni and cheese with a strained smile, making offhand comments about how heavy soul food was and how she preferred a cleaner, more refined diet. She would look around the historic working-class neighborhood where I had established my first commercial kitchen and lock her car doors with a dramatic click, loudly asking Jamal if he was sure the area was safe. It stung deeply. It felt like a deliberate slap to the culture and the beautiful community that had supported me when I had absolutely nothing. But the worst part was exactly how she treated my wealth. Chloe acted as if the money I bled for was her natural birthright. When Jamal proposed, she demanded a destination wedding that cost more than a starter home, and she expected me to foot the bill without a single complaint. She expected Jamal to pay for everything her heart desired. And by extension, she expected my bank accounts to be wide open for their lavish lifestyle. She would talk endlessly about expensive European vacations and designer handbags, constantly looking at me with an expectant smile waiting for me to offer to pay. And her brother Travis was no better. He was always hovering around my house uninvited, drinking my most expensive wine, and dropping heavy hints about needing a massive loan for his latest failed business venture. I saw right through both of them. I knew they looked down on me as just some lucky cook, yet they were more than happy to feast at my table and spend my money. But I bit my tongue. I swallowed my pride time and time again because I saw how Jamal looked at her. I wanted my son to be happy, so I played the accommodating, polite mother-in-law. I smiled warmly when Chloe made her backhanded compliments. I kept my mouth shut when they wildly overspent their budget. I maintained the illusion of peace because I believed that keeping my family together was worth the quiet disrespect I endured. I sacrificed my own comfort in my own home, tiptoeing around her delicate sensibilities, just to ensure Jamal never had to choose between his wife and his mother. I swallowed the disrespect like bitter medicine, hoping it would cure the tension, never realizing it was only feeding a monster. The true depth of that monster was finally exposed at the family dinner, where I put my plan into action. I had prepared a beautiful feast, the kind that took hours of standing over a hot stove, roasting meats and baking pies. As we sat around my large mahogany dining table, I took a deep breath, letting the tears well up in my eyes. I am a tough woman, but that night I channeled every ounce of vulnerability and fear I had left in me. I looked at Jamal and Chloe and tearfully announced that I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. I told them I had invested everything into a commercial real estate deal that had completely collapsed, taking my entire life savings and my business capital down with it. I sobbed, telling them the banks were calling in their massive loans, and I was practically penniless. I put on an Oscar-worthy performance, holding my breath, and expecting them to rush to my side to tell me that everything would be all right, and that we would figure it out together as a family. The shift in the room was immediate and violent. The warm, polite facade Chloe had maintained for years evaporated in a single instant. Her eyes went flat, cold, and calculating. She slowly put down her fork and stared at me not with pity, but with absolute disgust. She crossed her arms over her chest and coldly asked what I planned to do, making it clear they would not offer a single dime to help me. The very next morning, the real nightmare began. Chloe stopped calling me Mum altogether. The term of endearment she had weaponized for years to get her way was gone, without a trace. She walked into my house without knocking, slamming a thick stack of cheap, depressing nursing home brochures onto my coffee table. She spoke to me as if I were a pest, a sudden burden she was desperate to exterminate immediately. She told me I could no longer afford to live in the home I had paid off in cash years ago. She looked around my beautiful living room, the one I had decorated with the fruits of my labor, and aggressively criticized my presence in it. She complained that my house was way too big for a broke old woman, and announced that her brother Travis needed a place to stay to save money. I sat there in stunned silence as she treated me like an unwanted squatter in my own sanctuary. She did not see a grieving mother who had lost everything. She saw a useless asset taking up valuable real estate. The condescension in her voice was thick and unapologetic. She acted as if my sudden lack of funds completely erased my humanity, my history, and my authority. I watched my own daughter-in-law try to strip me of my dignity, dictating cruel terms in the very house my catering business had built. The mask was completely off, and the sheer naked disrespect was suffocating. I realized then that my financial ruin was not a tragedy to her. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for all along. The night felt heavier than it had ever felt in my entire life. I laid in my bed, staring up at the ceiling fan, while the silence of my own house seemed to mock me. Sleep was a luxury I simply could not afford that night. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and a deep, sickening knot twisted in my stomach. The stress of Chloe and her sudden cruelty, along with the chilling reality of her nursing home brochures, kept playing on a continuous loop in my mind. I had sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my body to give Jamal a life of ease, and this was the repayment I was getting. I tossed and turned until the digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2 in the morning. I needed a glass of water to soothe my dry throat, so I quietly slipped out of bed and wrapped my robe tightly around my shoulders. The hardwood floors were cold against my bare feet as I walked down the long hallway toward the kitchen. As I neared the guest room, I heard the faint, muffled sounds of a harsh conversation. The door was cracked open just a fraction of an inch, allowing a thin slice of light to spill out into the dark hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks. I held my breath perfectly still and listened carefully. It was Chloe, and her voice was a sharp, aggressive hiss. She was pacing the floor and laying into my son with a level of disrespect I could barely comprehend. I pressed myself against the wall, praying my breathing would not give me away. I heard her say the exact words that would shatter my motherly heart into a million irreparable pieces. She said that she is broke Jamal and that she is useless to us now. She continued saying that Travis needs a place to stay, and we can flip this house once we declare her incompetent. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Declare me incompetent. They wanted to strip away my mental autonomy, to steal the house I had bought, with decades of hot grease burns and aching joints. They wanted to throw me away like a broken appliance, just because they believed the well had finally run dry. My chest tightened so painfully I thought I might be having a heart attack. I waited for Jamal to speak up. I stood there in the dark, desperately waiting for the son I had nurtured and protected to defend my honor. I waited for him to tell his greedy wife to pack her bags and get out of my home. I waited for the boy who used to cling to my apron strings to become a man and protect his mother. But the silence that followed was the loudest noise I had ever heard in my 62 years on this earth. When Jamal finally spoke, his voice was low, weak, and utterly spineless. He murmured a pathetic agreement, saying whatever she thought was best to keep the peace. He chose his vicious wife over the mother who gave him the world. He agreed to let them label me crazy and steal my home, just so he would not have to argue with her. In that exact moment, the mother who loved Jamal unconditionally took her last breath. Something inside me snapped and shattered, but it did not leave me broken. It left me with a chilling, crystal-clear vision. I turned around and walked silently back to my bedroom. I did not shed a single tear. The heartbreak completely burned away, leaving nothing behind but cold, hard calculation. I was no longer a grieving mother looking for her son's love. I was a businesswoman who had survived the absolute worst this world had to offer. And nobody, not even my own flesh and blood, was going to take what was mine. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I had a bulletproof plan. I waited until Jamal and Chloe left the house to go run their errands, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. They smiled their fake smiles, and I smiled right back, playing the part of the defeated, broke old woman they thought I was. The second their car pulled out of the driveway, my entire demeanor changed. I picked up my phone and called a private security contractor I had used for years to protect my commercial kitchens and catering warehouses. I told him I needed a favor immediately and that money was absolutely no object. Within the hour, his team was inside my home, installing high-definition hidden cameras in the living room, the hallways, the kitchen, and most importantly, my private home office. They were completely undetectable, disguised as smoke detectors and decorative items. If Chloe and Travis thought they were dealing with a clueless old woman, they were sadly mistaken. They were dealing with a boss who knew exactly how to protect her assets. That afternoon, Travis arrived carrying 2 duffel bags, acting like he was the new king of my castle. He sauntered through my front door without wiping his feet, tracking dirt onto my expensive rugs. He smirked at me and tossed his keys onto my kitchen counter with a level of entitlement that made my blood boil. But I did not confront him. I kept my mouth shut, offered him a polite nod, and retreated to my bedroom to watch the live camera feeds on my tablet. I watched like a hawk as the real show began. The minute they thought I was asleep, Travis slipped out of his room and crept straight into my home office. I watched the screen as this lazy, arrogant man who had never worked a hard day in his life began rummaging through my filing cabinets. He pulled out my personal folders, flipping frantically through my bank statements, my old tax returns, and my life insurance policies. He was practically salivating at the thought of cashing in on my demise. I watched him take pictures of my financial documents with his cell phone, his face illuminated by the screen in the dark room. He was not just snooping, he was actively plotting financial fraud. He was gathering the exact account numbers they would need once they managed to execute their sick plan to declare me legally incompetent. Seeing a stranger violate my private sanctuary, touching the documents that represented a lifetime of my sweat and tears, filled me with a righteous fury I had never known. But I sat perfectly still in my bedroom, letting the cameras record every single second of his blatant criminal behavior. They thought I was a vulnerable target, ripe for the picking, but they were willingly handing me the exact ammunition I needed to destroy them. The plot thickened in a way that truly proved how evil and desperate they were. 2 days later, I was sitting on my bed reviewing the audio feeds from the security cameras. I pulled up a recording from the kitchen where Chloe and Travis were having a hushed meeting over coffee while Jamal was at work. Chloe pulled a thick manila folder out of her designer tote bag and slid it across the kitchen island to her brother. I turned the volume up on my tablet, pressing the speaker close to my ear. I heard Chloe whisper excitedly to Travis, telling him to listen to her. She said she met with that guy downtown last night and he finalized the paperwork. She bragged that she paid him a few thousand in cash and he forged my signature perfectly. She confidently stated that they had the transfer of deed completely drawn up and notarized. Travis let out a low, greedy laugh and replied, saying it was almost too easy. Chloe bragged about how brilliant her plan was. She explicitly stated that since I was completely bankrupt, I would not even have the money to hire a cheap lawyer to fight the property transfer in court. She assumed I was so financially ruined that I would be forced out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back, unable to defend myself against their forged documents. They were planning to steal my home right out from under me using a fake signature and a corrupt notary. They were not just ungrateful, opportunistic relatives anymore. They were literal criminals committing serious felonies in my own kitchen. I listened to Chloe gloating about how much money they would make when they flipped the house and kicked me to the curb. She laughed about how pathetic I looked when I announced I was broke. I sat in my bedroom staring at the screen, feeling a dark, powerful satisfaction wash over me. They were acting so incredibly bold because they thought they had the upper hand. They thought they had cornered a helpless, broke old woman who had nothing left to lose. But they had no idea that every word, every laugh, and every forged document was being recorded in crystal clear, high definition. They had dug their own graves and handed me the shovel. I took a deep breath, downloaded the files to a secure external hard drive, and smiled. They wanted a war over my empire, and I was more than ready to give them one. The morning it all finally came to a head was a chilly Tuesday. I was standing in the very center of my custom-built kitchen, running a soft cloth over the cool granite island. I had paid for that granite with years of tired feet and aching joints from standing over deep fryers and industrial ovens. The house was quiet for just a moment, but the heavy knot in my stomach told me the storm was coming. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, breathing in the steam and bracing my spirit for whatever foolishness my daughter-in-law had planned next. I did not have to wait long. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hardwood hallway. Chloe marched into my kitchen with her brother Travis right on her heels. Travis had a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face, looking around my beautiful home, as if he had already picked out which of my antique vases he was going to sell first. Behind them, dragging his feet like a frightened little boy, was my son, Jamal. He would not even look up from the floor. Chloe slammed a thick stack of stapled papers right onto my clean granite island. The loud smack made my coffee cup rattle in its saucer. I looked at the papers and then slowly raised my eyes to look at her. I asked her what this was supposed to be. Chloe crossed her arms over her chest and tilted her chin up, staring down her nose at me. She said, "These are the documents that are going to save you from ending up on the street, Beverly." She tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the top page. She told me it was a transfer of deed and a durable power of attorney granting Travis full control of my estate. She claimed that because I was entirely bankrupt, the bank was going to foreclose on my house by the end of the week. She said Travis was doing me a massive favor by taking the property off my hands so he could assume the financial burden. I stared at her, feeling a mixture of absolute disgust and quiet amazement at her sheer audacity. She actually believed I was foolish enough to sign away the home I owned free and clear, just because she printed out some fake legal jargon. I told her I would not be signing a single thing. I told her this was my house, my property, and my life. Travis stepped forward, then puffing out his chest, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate a 62-year-old woman. He leaned over the island, getting entirely too close to my face. He told me I was not in any position to negotiate. He said if I did not sign those papers right then and there, they were going to call Adult Protective Services. He threatened to tell the state authorities that I was completely senile, that I was a danger to myself, and that my mental decline had caused my financial ruin. Chloe chimed in with a vicious smile. She said she had already picked out a state-run facility for me. She described it in brutal detail, telling me it was a grim, underfunded ward where they lock the doors from the outside and leave the elderly sitting in the dark all day. She said if I made this difficult, she would personally see to it that I spent my remaining years rotting in a place that smelled like bleach and despair. My hands began to tremble. It was not from fear, but from a deep, agonizing heartbreak that threatened to swallow me whole. I looked past the two white vultures standing in my kitchen and locked my eyes on Jamal. My only child, the boy I had rocked to sleep when he had a fever. The boy I had worked 18-hour shifts to put through an Ivy League university so he would never have to face this kind of cruelty in the world. I called his name. My voice was thick with emotion, raw and desperate. I asked him directly if he was going to stand there and let them do this to his mother. I gave him one last chance to be the man I raised him to be. I waited for him to step forward to push Travis out of the way, to tell his wife that they were leaving and never coming back. I prayed with every fiber of my being that my son would defend me. Jamal slowly shifted his weight. He looked at the floor, then glanced nervously at Chloe, before finally meeting my eyes. His gaze was completely empty. There was no love, no loyalty, and no courage left in him. He shoved his hands into his pockets and mumbled that it was for the best, Mum. He said I could not take care of myself anymore, and that Chloe knew what she was doing. He said I just needed to sign the papers so we could all move on. In that exact fraction of a second, my heart simply stopped breaking and turned to solid steel. The mother who had loved Jamal unconditionally died right there on the kitchen floor. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The tears that had been burning the backs of my eyes dried up. I was no longer a grieving mother hoping for her son's affection. I was a self-made businesswoman who had survived the absolute worst this world had to offer. And I was looking at 3 trespassers in my home. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply nodded slowly, deliberately, portraying the image of a defeated, broken woman. I told them I needed a moment to process everything. I said I needed to go for a walk to clear my head before I signed my entire life away. Chloe smiled triumphantly, exchanging a victorious glance with Travis. She told me to take my time, but to be back in an hour to sign on the dotted line. I turned my back on them and walked out the front door. I stepped out into the crisp morning air and walked directly to my luxury SUV parked in the driveway. The minute I closed the heavy car door, the act was over. I sat up perfectly straight, adjusted my rearview mirror, and started the engine. I let them think they had won the war while I drove away to secure their absolute destruction. I drove straight downtown to the financial district. The towering glass buildings reflected the morning sun as I pulled into the private underground parking garage of my wealth management firm. I walked through the polished brass doors and was immediately greeted by the receptionist, who offered me coffee and escorted me directly to the executive suites. I commanded respect in this building because they knew exactly who Beverly was. I sat down in a plush leather chair across the mahogany desk from my private banker, Mr. Sterling. He was a sharp, impeccably dressed man who had managed my portfolio for the last decade. He smiled warmly and asked how I was enjoying my fake retirement. I told him the vacation was over and it was time to get to work. Mr. Sterling pulled up my actual financial profiles on his large monitor. We spent the next hour reviewing my assets. My wealth was completely staggering and utterly secure. I had millions of dollars safely tucked away in offshore trusts, diverse stock portfolios, and untouchable limited liability companies. My business empire was insulated by layers of corporate protections that a petty scammer like Travis could not even begin to comprehend, much less penetrate with a forged deed. I was financially invincible. Then I asked Mr. Sterling to open the secondary file we had discussed earlier in the week. I wanted to see the detailed background check on Chloe and Travis. Mr. Sterling clicked a few buttons and pulled up their financial history. The reality of their lives was honestly pathetic. Mr. Sterling explained that Chloe and Travis had been drowning in massive debt for years. They drove luxury cars they could not afford, carried designer bags bought on maxed-out credit cards, and took expensive European vacations solely to impress people on social media. They were living in a constant state of financial freefall, but the most revealing part was how they had tried to finance their latest scheme. Mr. Sterling leaned forward, folding his hands on his desk. He explained that Travis and Chloe had recently taken out a massive high-interest loan from a predatory private lending firm. They needed the cash desperately to keep up their wealthy facade and to pay off previous debts that were entering collections. To secure this massive new loan, they had used a shell company and submitted fraudulent documentation, claiming they had equity in a multi-million-dollar property. That property was my house. They had essentially bet their entire financial future on the assumption that they could force me out and seize my home to pay off their illegal loans. I sat back in my leather chair, letting the sheer audacity of their stupidity wash over me. They really thought they could outsmart a woman who had built an empire from scratch. But then Mr. Sterling smiled a slow, dangerous smile that matched my own. He looked at me and delivered the news that would become the ultimate poetic justice. He reminded me that my primary holding corporation, the entity that manages my excess capital, specializes in purchasing distressed debt from private lenders. It is a highly profitable way to keep my money working for me. Mr. Sterling quietly informed me that when he saw Travis and Chloe's names flag in the financial system, he took immediate action. He utilized my corporate funds to purchase their entire loan portfolio from the predatory lender. He did it quietly, legally, and months before my birthday dinner. The realization hit me like a beautiful bolt of lightning. I did not just have more money than them. I literally owned their debt. Every single dime they owed, every car payment they were behind on, every fraudulent loan they had taken out belonged to me. I was their biggest and only creditor. Mr. Sterling explained the acceleration clauses hidden deep within their loan contracts. Because they had used fraudulent collateral to secure the funds, the holding company had the legal right to demand the entire balance of the loan immediately. If they could not pay the full amount in cash within 24 hours, the holding company could legally seize all their assets, freeze their bank accounts, and file federal fraud charges against them for using fake property deeds. I sat in the quiet elegance of that banking office, listening to the hum of the city traffic outside the window. I thought about the cheap nursing home brochures sitting on my coffee table. I thought about Travis threatening to call Adult Protective Services and having me locked away in a bleak ward. I thought about Jamal, my own flesh and blood, looking at the floor and telling me my destruction was for the best. I looked at Mr. Sterling and calmly told him to execute the acceleration clause immediately. I told him to draft the foreclosure notices, the asset seizure orders, and the fraud complaints. I wanted every single piece of legal weaponry loaded and ready to fire. As I stood up to leave the bank, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my spirit. Chloe and Travis thought they were dealing with a frightened, senile woman who had lost her last dime. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to their entire lives over to the very woman they were trying to destroy. I walked out of the financial district with my head held high, ready to return to my home and deliver a reckoning they would never forget. The drive back to my house felt different. This time, I was no longer a grieving mother carrying the weight of a broken heart. I was a queen returning to defend her castle. I parked my car in the driveway and walked up the front steps with a spine made of steel. When I pushed open the front door, I was greeted by the ultimate sight of sheer disrespect. Chloe and Travis were actually in my living room, stuffing my beautiful custom-made clothes, my expensive shoes, and my precious family photo albums into cheap black heavy-duty trash bags. They were laughing and tossing my entire life away like garbage. And my son Jamal, my own flesh and blood. He was just standing there by the staircase, leaning against the wall, looking down at his expensive shoes, doing absolutely nothing to stop them. Chloe looked up and smirked, her pale face glowing with arrogant satisfaction. She told me my time was up. She said I needed to grab one of those trash bags, pack up my worthless junk, and get out before she called the police to have the crazy broke lady forcibly escorted off the premises. I stood tall. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the antique clock on the wall and waited. Right on cue, a loud, sharp knock echoed through the front door. Jamal jumped nervously, but Travis puffed out his chest and yanked the door open fully, expecting to intimidate whoever was on the other side. Instead, he came face to face with Mr. Sterling, my private banker. Standing right behind him was the local county sheriff and two very aggressive-looking men from my corporate legal team. The smug grin slid right off Travis' face and hit the floor. Chloe dropped the heavy trash bag she was holding. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. She demanded to know what was going on and who these men were. I walked right past her and stood proudly next to Mr. Sterling and the authorities. I looked Chloe dead in her eyes and handed her a thick manila envelope. I told her to open it. Her hands were physically shaking as she pulled out the legal documents. It was the official foreclosure notice and the immediate demand for payment in full on the massive high-interest loan she and her brother had illegally taken out. I watched the color completely drain from her face as she read the name of the primary creditor and realized it was my holding company. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, unable to form a single word. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and pressed play. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio of Chloe and Travis sitting in my kitchen, planning to forge my signature and steal my house, filled the silent room. Every cruel word they had spoken was broadcast for the sheriff to hear. The sheriff immediately stepped forward and placed his hand on his utility belt. I stepped much closer to Chloe, ensuring she felt the full weight of my presence. I told her I am not bankrupt, Chloe. My catering and soul food empire is worth more than you will ever see in your entire pathetic lifetime. But as of 9:00 this morning, you certainly are bankrupt. The fallout was swift, absolute, and incredibly satisfying. The sheriff stepped right into my living room and formally read Travis his rights. They placed him in cold steel handcuffs, right there over the trash bags filled with my clothes. He was arrested for attempted fraud and forgery, based on the undeniable video evidence I had handed over to my legal team. Chloe started hyperventilating. Her arrogant posture crumbled as she fell to her knees, begging and pleading for mercy. She looked at Jamal, crying for him to do something to save them from this nightmare. But Jamal was paralyzed. The reality of his wife's vicious betrayal and his own cowardly complicity had finally broken his spirit. Chloe was left completely penniless. Her luxury cars set for immediate repossession, and her dignity thoroughly shattered in front of the authorities. I pointed to the open front door and told them all to get out of my house immediately. Jamal tried to reach out to me with tears in his eyes, murmuring a pathetic apology. I looked my son squarely in the face. My heart ached for the little boy I once held. But the man standing before me was a stranger. I told him he was officially cut out of my will. I told him he chose his path and chose his wicked wife over the mother who gave him the world. Now he had to walk that path without a single dime of my money to cushion his inevitable fall. They walked out of my door with absolutely nothing. That evening, the house was finally mine again. I made myself a hot cup of chamomile tea and walked out to my back porch. I sat in my favorite rocking chair listening to the evening crickets. I breathed in the absolute silence and tasted the sweet freedom of a woman who had successfully protected her peace, her dignity, and her empire. True wealth is not just sitting in your bank account, ladies. It is in knowing your worth and never letting anyone, not even your own family, treat you like a discount item. If they only love you for what you can give them, they do not love you at all. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me down in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Stay strong, queens. Until next time.